Let's have a big round of applause for Margaret Stewart. She's the VP of Product Design at Facebook, who previously led design at YouTube and Google. Let's have a big round of applause for Margaret.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate you having me. It's a big honor to be here to share the stage with so many talented design leaders and many of them long-term friends and colleagues. It's funny because almost exactly 10 years ago today, I gave a speech at the University of Michigan at a conference much like this one, and it was all about the future of design. And as I was preparing my remarks for today, I wanted to revisit that talk because I was curious about how it held up. So here it is, and I want you to know that I'm really cringing at the design of these slides. It's like looking at my high school hair in the 1980s. But I had to get over my own aesthetic ego to address a much more important set of issues. That little frog on the right was my organizing metaphor for how I believed we as designers should be thinking about the social internet. Elephants, I noted, are great parents. They have one offspring at a time, and they spend a lot of time and energy taking care of them to see them to adulthood. And frogs, on the other hand, are radically hands-off. They are the polar opposite of today's helicopter parents. They do a lot of work laying and hiding eggs, but after that, they let fate take over. And some tadpoles make it, and most don't. So 10 years ago, I said, design should take inspiration from the frog. As designers, our job was to do the best that we could, building and designing systems for the internet, and then we had an obligation to cede power, to get out of the way and let people take control and design their own experiences. And I want to play a couple of clips from this talk for you.
Now, many eggs don't end up as frogs, but a few, and the right number by the math of nature, survive and flourish. And this is a useful metaphor for the current explosion in access to personal expression and communication tools. Blogs, Twitter, YouTube, and the like are all examples of open systems that break open access to media and distribution like never before. We don't know exactly what people will do with these tools, and we don't know who will produce something extraordinary. In the future, we'll be more like frogs and less like elephants. Because while opening up the floodgates to personal expression and communication tools creates a flood of potential noise, it also creates the most diverse set of faces and voices we've ever seen and heard in human history.
Another even more poignant clip.
In the future, people won't just consume. They will produce, and they'll design too. I believe in order to take full advantage of the power and potential of design and technology to improve people's lives, you have to be an optimist, and you have to believe that man is inherently good. You have to believe that each individual deserves the right to speak his or her mind, have his or her story told, and not be encumbered by bureaucracy or power structures. If you don't believe that, then you're going to have a really hard time in the future.
Well, it's the future, and I think my prophecy of people having a really hard time has definitely come true, but not necessarily in the way that I thought it would. Since I gave that talk, the public discussion about the internet has moved from focusing on primarily on hopes of what we have for what people can do with it to significant fears about what people might do with it. Now, I can't go back in time and talk to my previous self, but if I could, I think I would have a few things to say to young Margaret. First, I would warn myself that there are definitely some dark clouds gathering on the horizon that will test the youthful optimism that I projected back then. Now, to be clear, it's critical to be optimistic because you can't innovate without it. But I would say to my younger self what I'm saying to all of you today, that optimism is not enough. This is a pair of some of my favorite posters from the Facebook Analog Research Laboratory. And it's a critical reminder that responsibility requires us to cultivate a healthy skepticism to sit alongside our optimism. Skepticism about people, because not all of them will act in good faith or with good intentions. And skepticism about technology, because not all of the outcomes will be positive, even when the tools are used as designed. Speaking of skepticism, I know given the current climate that some of you might be feeling skeptical listening to me right now, given where I work. And I think that skepticism's fair. It's true that there have been a lot of times when we at Facebook have been too slow to see the risks and spot abuse on our platforms, or moved too fast to have time to anticipate them. In response, we've changed a lot about Facebook, from our investments in technology and staffing to keep people safe on the platform, to providing better transparency and controls on the data that we collect, all the way to changing the mission of the company, shifting it from a focus on making connections to a more holistic vision of building community and bringing people closer together. But we have so much more work to do to rebuild trust. I think of my talk today as a set of critical edits and addendums to my earlier speech, a way of exploring the longer, more complex, and still evolving story about what responsible design looks like in a connected world. I care so much about this topic that I've actually shifted my career to focus on it as my core job, leading the responsible innovation and design team at Facebook. Our group supports the work of thousands of people across the company who are looking to keep people safe on the platform, but we're also looking for ways to get ahead of these problems early in the product design cycle. Over my 25-year career, I've had the privilege of helping to create some of the most powerful digital technologies of the last 50 years. And through that experience, I've learned a lot of lessons, some exhilarating and some painful. So today, I'd like to start a conversation with you about ways that we as designers, but also our colleagues in engineering, product management, data science, how we can approach our work in this seemingly uncontrolled and uncontrollable space called the internet. One thing I can tell you is that our responsibility begins way before we ever sit down to sketch or create a mock. Before we jump into crafting solutions, we need to familiarize ourselves with similar problems that have come before. And this is why my first note on responsible design is that we have to study up. Because responsible design is a student of history. In the tech industry, we tend to think that the challenges and problems we face are all new, but they're not. The speed and the scale of our platforms may be unprecedented, but the issues we face around the unintended consequences of technological inventions have been around for a long time. For example, in her book, The Ethics of Invention, Harvard professor Sheila Jasanoff writes extensively about the consequences of inventions like genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, which have the potential to reduce global poverty, but also have broader effects on health and the environment. It may feel like worlds away from inventions like social media, but there are important lessons to be learned about how GMOs ended up being largely rejected by many communities and why. This is just one example. Being a good designer doesn't mean just studying design or design history. We have a responsibility to study the past and learn from it through a multidisciplinary lens. This is why over the past few years, I've been spending less time reading design treatises and more time reading history books, and collaborating with constitutional lawyers, human rights experts, urban planners, ethicists, and other experts who didn't factor into my practice 10 years ago. That's the other thing I would tell young Margaret, is to prepare to meet and debate with a whole lot of super smart people, because these new, diverse perspectives and sources of criticism will help you consider design decisions in a more expansive and holistic way. Which leads me to my second note. Responsible design considers long-term systemic effects. If history is about looking backwards, this is about looking forwards. Technology can address many important social issues, but in complex systems, even a well-intended attempt to fix one thing can generate a whole set of new problems. It reminds me of those horror movies where the hero kills one monster and breathes a sigh of relief, only to realize that 10 more have spawned up in its place. Now, we don't have proven methods for addressing systemic risk in the tech industry, and so we have to look at other domains and industries for insight. For example, I've become increasingly interested in exploring what we can learn from city and urban planning. In particular, I've been intrigued by the practice of environmental impact reports. If If a developer wants to build a big resort in most places in the United States, they can't just drop it onto a piece of land like a hotel on a monopoly board. Instead, developers have to do their best to assess and predict the project's impact on a whole host of things like the local air, water, plants, wildlife, and vulnerable communities. And they have to forecast what these impacts will look like, not just in the short term, but over time. Now, this is a pretty overwhelming number of things to research and predict, and these reports often don't get it right. But the systemic approach helps developers and communities understand how interconnected things are and to develop a better shared understanding of the potential second and third order effects on the environment. A specific example that illustrates this point is our ever-evolving approach to designing ways for people to engage with content on Facebook and Instagram. Like counts are everywhere because in some ways they make a lot of sense. It can feel good to get a sense of what others think about and whether they like what we share. But over time, we saw some unintended effects of this UI. It started to affect not just how people felt about the content, but how they felt about themselves, sometimes stirring up a sense of envy or anxiety. This is not the kind of impact that we want to have on people's lives, nor was it our product goal. So as you can see from this Halloween post about my dog Sunny, or as we like to call her, Sunny the Vampire Slayer, we've recently been testing removing the like count from the UI of both the Facebook app and Instagram in the hopes that people will refocus on authentically sharing the things they care about and less on other people's response to it. I know this seems like a tiny UI change, but it's actually, I think, a pretty good example of how small aspects of a product's design can have an amplified effect at scale. Now, this is only in the testing phase, and it certainly won't be a silver bullet solution for what is certainly a multifaceted social issue. But it's an example of where we're trying to mitigate unintended systemic long-term effects. Like with environmental impact reports, we need to think about our work through the lens of sustainability. It's not just about getting the numbers up in the short term, but figuring out ways to assess both qualitatively and quantitatively whether we're truly enhancing people's lives over time and how to sustain that value. Now, this won't be easy. As we all know, the future is famously unpredictable. In the work I'm leading around responsible innovation, we're exploring all kinds of ways to do this. Scenario planning methods that were developed by the military, futurist techniques, which were inspired by early science fiction writers, consequence scanning, and more. And we're trying to draw from as many approaches as possible to build a more flexible toolkit for our teams. And I'm also really inspired by firms like Institute for the Future and Everyone, which are doing really important work in this area. And if you're interested in these ideas and methods, you should check them out because they offer a lot of information on their websites. So once we've taken stock of history and taken that longer-term systemic view, we need to bring that lens of healthy skepticism to our work so we can anticipate and proactively mitigate harm. In the startup phase, it's natural to want to build things quickly and get them out into market. And if things go wrong, you respond as best you can. That launch and see what happens approach is never wholly responsible. But when you're a startup, your blast radius is pretty small if things go wrong. But the stakes are so much higher at the scale and speed of global platforms. We need to take care to not rush into solutions that affect the lives of billions. We need to take the time to create intentional touch points for reflecting not just on how things will go right, but the ways in which things might go wrong. And then we need to proactively plan mitigation strategies to minimize that harm. This work needs to, of course, include traditional red teaming to make systems robust enough to withstand adversarial attacks and misuse by bad actors. But we also need to think about the ways in which our products and technologies can cause harm even when they're used as intended. For example, I find Batya Friedman's work out of the University of Washington on value-sensitive design to be a compelling model for how to approach this really difficult task. One of the things that really resonated with me about her work is the importance of focusing not just on direct stakeholders, those for whom we intentionally design and who interact with our products and services, but also indirect stakeholders who may not engage directly with what we make, but whose lives are affected by the use of others of those products and services. Now, as you can imagine, that group of indirect stakeholders is significantly larger and more diverse than the direct stakeholders. This was something I thought a lot about during my early years at Facebook when I worked on the design of our advertising tools. While the businesses directly using our ad products numbered in the low millions, the use by that group affected lives of billions of people through advertising experiences in our products. So in our design process, we had to do our best to anticipate the ways in which our products could unintentionally cause harm for this larger stakeholder community. One example of us trying to anticipate harm that might impact that broader group is when we launched Why Am I Seeing This Ad?, which allows people to see details of why a particular ad is showing up in their feed. It also gives them the ability to remove themselves from particular targeting categories and even block specific advertisers from targeting them in the future. This was an industry first, and as you can imagine, was not popular with all advertisers given the power that it gave people to block marketing messages. But we felt the transparency and control for people was important to prioritize. But even when we work hard to anticipate and mitigate harm, we're destined to miss things. And we have to acknowledge that in a complex social system operating at scale, it's actually impossible to anticipate all harm and reduce it to zero. And this is a painful thing to accept because none of us got into this work to hurt people. We got into it to lift people up, to create a more inclusive and equitable world. But we have to accept it because that's the only way we can be honest and intentional about the inevitable trade-offs that we need to make when designing for complex systems. Which is a good segue into this note, that responsible design doesn't oversimplify the problems or the solutions. I used to subscribe to that notion, if you can't explain it to a fifth grader, it must not make sense. And sometimes that really is the case. But in this kind of work, we often encounter situations that force us to understand complex trade-offs between competing values and then make difficult choices about what we choose to optimize for. It's a myth that there is a single right answer to these kinds of challenges, which is why I try to avoid the expression, do the right thing. If there were a single, clear, obvious right thing, we would already be doing it. Now, recently I was discussing this with NYU professor Clay Shirky, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said, social settings present dilemmas rather than problems. Problems have solutions, whereas dilemmas only have optimizations. I think that's a reality that we need to sit with for a moment. Now, I consider myself to be a lifelong, compulsive problem solver. That's actually a huge part of my personal identity and the way that I see myself adding value to the world. So it's been a long learning journey for me to distinguish between problems which can be solved and dilemmas which are much more complicated to navigate because there is no right solution. Reducing a dilemma into a problem to be solved can feel good in the short term, but it is often not the responsible approach. And responsible design can't just deliver theories on how things should work. It needs to figure out how to operationalize those remedies at scale while also being inclusive, fair, and safe. A good example of this inherent complexity is what we do when someone who uses our product passes away. Now, you might think, well, it's not that complicated, they're dead, so close the account, right? But it's a mistake to oversimplify this scenario that, along with taxes, is pretty much the only thing we all have in common. We call this process memorialization to reflect something that we learned the hard way early on. It's not only about the person who passed away or their account. It's also about designing for the experience of the many people who knew and loved them, those indirect stakeholders. Initially, we defined the problem too narrowly. Unfortunately, accounts of the deceased are prone to being hacked, and we wanted to lock down that security threat, so we allowed anyone to memorialize accounts. But family and friends told us that when a stranger memorializes an account, it felt like they weren't in control of the process, so we changed our process so that an account could only be memorialized by friends and family. But allowing this to happen then risked overriding the deceased person's privacy preferences. So we evolved the experience to create a tributes tab, separate from the original timeline, where loved ones can gather and share memories. But as we did global research, we learned how complicated it is to effectively and compassionately serve people around the globe as they grieve. For example, we found that some families' religious beliefs say that it's more difficult for their loved one's soul to move on to the afterlife if photos of them are still available. So they wanted the account completely deleted as quickly as possible. So let's review the feature request list from the memorialization team. Protect my loved one's account from being hacked, but don't memorialize my loved one's account without my permission. Respect my privacy wishes after I die, but give me access to my loved one's timeline so I can pay tribute. Don't delete my loved one's account because I want to use it as a place for tributes, but delete my loved one's account immediately to enable them to peacefully transition to heaven. These conflicting requests are really hard to come to terms with because while each of them is completely legitimate, they're also in conflict with each other. Now, I've always felt that my job as a designer is to simplify the problem so it can be solved. But there's no responsible way to simplify the grieving process. The best that we can do is understand and empathize with as much of the complexity and diversity and nuance as we can to inform our priorities and to accept the hardest reality of all, that there are no neutral design choices. Back when I had all of that curly hair, I used to believe that as product designers of these global platforms, we were creating agnostic containers, neutral vessels for other people's ideas and beliefs. But over the years, I've realized that the reality is far more complicated. Every time we design a user interface for a product or a feature, we are making decisions on behalf of people, decisions that fundamentally reflect our values to the world and that can affect people everywhere, whether or not we intend it. Designers must cultivate the practice of reflecting early on what values are driving an organization or a project so that we can be clear and honest with ourselves and the world about the values that are shaping our work. Earlier, I brought up frogs and elephants, so I think it's important to talk about an elephant that is on stage with me here today. That's on a lot of people's minds. The relationship between political speech, paid advertisements, and false news or misleading information on Facebook and many other social media platforms. This is one of those dilemmas that we must avoid oversimplifying. On the one hand, there's a strongly held belief, perhaps the most fundamental belief at Facebook, that every human has the right to have a voice and to have that voice be heard. It's something I still believe in as much as I did when I gave that speech 10 years ago. Now, this position is not values neutral. It is values laden. All things being equal, we feel we should optimize for giving people a voice. But things are not always equal. Misinformation can harm communities, especially vulnerable communities, and especially at critical times like elections. The question is, how do we come up with a model where we're serving people by giving them a chance to see the content that they want, while also cutting down on misinformation without having Facebook be the judge of what's true? Based on what I've learned over the past 10 years, we have to study the history of political speech, consider the long-term systemic impact of our decisions, anticipate and mitigate the harms that might result, not oversimplify the problem or the solution, and accept that there are no neutral choices in a dilemma like this. So let's walk through this, what this might mean. First, there's a long history of misinformation harming society, but also of censorship doing the same. There aren't as many historical examples about social networks since they're so new, but the free flow of information has long been a critical component of human freedom. What can we learn from how these stories of the past have played out, and how might we apply them to today's dilemmas? Next, the systemic effects of both misinformation and censorship are really complex. Any decision that we make has to take a broad view of these effects and their impact, in particular, on marginalized groups. People may think that we're doing the right thing by deciding what's true or what's not, but downstream, despite everyone's best intentions, voices and causes that should be heard could be silenced and ignored. Now, we believe it's important to democracy to allow political speech, perhaps the most scrutinized kind of speech that there is, to be judged and open by the public. But that doesn't mean that our hands are tied. We can anticipate and must mitigate harm that might result. In fact, since the 2016 US election, we've taken a number of steps to anticipate and mitigate the harm of misinformation. For example, we don't allow political posts or ads that might result in voter disenfranchisement, like lying about where polls are or what ID you need to vote. And we don't allow content that might incite violence. Specifically when it comes to ads, while we don't remove political ads based solely on the outcome of a fact check, we still require them to follow all of our ad policies, which prohibit things like hate speech, and are even stricter when it comes to ads that expressly discourage people from voting. Our systems still proactively review ads from politicians, relying primarily on automated review, but in some cases manual review to check ads against those policies. And we've invested heavily in ad transparency tools. We have a political ads library, so anyone, the general public, the press, and other watchdog functions can scrutinize every ad that's run. You can see every message, who saw it, how much was spent, something that no TV or print media does. We've considered shutting down political ads entirely. Well, they're certainly not a large percentage of our business or worth the controversy from a financial perspective. But as I said, things are not that simple. In the same way that our ad system has been an equalizer for small businesses, it's also helped amplify local politicians and historically underrepresented groups. Political ads are a major lifeline for local candidates, up-and-coming challengers, and advocacy groups that may not get as much attention otherwise. If we remove all political ads, including political issue ads, we would be censoring a significant amount of political speech. And since more ads are about issues than elections, it's not clear how we'd define political. Would we ban all ads about climate change? It's considered political by some, but should it be? If so, then what about ads for SUVs or oil companies that don't mention politics specifically, but whose existence can also be said to be political? Would we ban all ads about healthcare and immigration as well? And while the upcoming US 2020 election is foremost in many of our minds, we have to remember that 90% of the people who use our products are outside of the US and Canada. So we would have to oversee political speech at an unprecedented scale all around the world. And that would be hugely problematic in an environment where context is everything. There are no neat and tidy answers to this inherently wicked problem, and there are definitely no neutral choices. But looking ahead, we have to continue to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which we can reduce the virality of misinformation? What are the ways that we can protect the most crucial times right before elections? What are the parallels and precedents that we can draw from other media while acknowledging that social media presents new and different challenges? And how can we as designers use the power of the UI to better educate and inform our citizenry? These are all open topics, both inside and outside of our company, and we welcome the conversation and debate. I know this is a hot-button topic, and that a lot of people might disagree with what we're doing on this issue. I'm addressing this with you today because I think it's important for me to share that I too have deep concerns about this, even as I'm trying to keep the bigger picture in mind so I don't fall into the oversimplification trap. Compared to where I was 10 years ago, I think you can see my thinking has evolved a bit. I still agree with much of what I said back then, it's just that I've learned there is so much more to the story. And rest assured, this is by no means a comprehensive list. It's ever evolving in my mind. And I could talk for hours about the many dimensions of responsibility that I'm still doing my best to figure out, but I also know that I'm the only thing that stands between us and happy hour. So I promise to share more as things become clear in my mind and as our work in responsible innovation and design continues to evolve. All this being said, I think it's very important for me to state that I don't regret helping build these products. I've spent my whole career building tools that democratize powerful systems that were previously only available to an elite few. Tools that have brought unprecedented opportunity to the world to access information, to express ourselves creatively, and to get and stay connected to the people that you care about most. These are enduring human needs that technology and design can and should help address. So despite everything, I would not want to go back to a world before these inventions. It's because I believe that they are so valuable that I'm committed to making sure that we design and deploy them in the most responsible way possible. And I also fundamentally believe that even though we at Facebook are in the spotlight right now, and rightly so, these problems that seem like Facebook problems are also the internet's problems. Even if you can't get behind Facebook and our attempts to address these challenges on our platforms, we all need to be working diligently at the frontier of these vital social issues. So whether you're designing social media, or financial services, or healthcare, or education, or government, or any of the other many industries vital to our social infrastructure, you are already or will soon be facing your own dilemmas that require a nuanced and responsible approach. Now, you may ask yourself, how the hell am I going to do all of this? I'm just a single designer. And it's true, these dilemmas are so complex, no one person can address them. This is a highly collaborative effort, and hopefully you're at a company like mine where there is live and active debate about these issues. If not, you have to start these conversations. We may not be able to provide all the answers, but design is very well positioned to force the discussions and put people at the center of the story. This is why I'm committing the rest of my career to this work, and why I want to share as much of it as I can in the coming months and years, because this is not something that anyone should be thinking of in a competitive way. It would be the ultimate race to the bottom. A lot rests on us figuring out the right way forward. And this is a crucial moment where we can come together to play a role in thinking through these values and contributing to the wider debates. And decades from now, I want us to look back and see that we were on the right side of history on as many of these issues as possible. It's so hard to know what that means today when we're in the middle of all of these storms. And sometimes what seems right in the moment looks different over the fullness of time. And 10 years from now, perhaps I'll be back on a stage once again, wearing thicker glasses, but probably with AR capabilities. And I'll likely be looking back at the choices that we made at this critical time, not just about political advertising, but also AI, AR and VR, cryptocurrency, and all of the other exciting but scary advancements we're living through in real time. And I can tell you that these past few years have definitely been the most challenging chapter of my career so far. But in addition to the heavy responsibility, I also feel it's an enormous privilege to play a part in responsibly securing these incredibly important advancements for the world, and to do so in a way that will make my kids and maybe someday my grandkids proud of the work that I've done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not even going to try to put a one-liner to sum up the talk or anything, but I hope not just Margaret's talk, but the entire programming of the summit gave you a lot of food for thought, not just about the craft and domain of design that we all live and breathe, but also the responsibilities that it comes with. Okay, just 5 minutes more, and then we all can head to the after party. So first of all, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming and making our second year of Design Leadership Summit so exciting and so amazing. So a big round of applause for all of you. Thank you. Definitely, again, nothing would be possible without the amazing support of these sponsors. And also, if you saw a consistent theme throughout most of the talks, which was about not forgetting the human elements, behind these massive organizations and brand names that we look at. So before I ask you to applaud for all the sponsors, massive shout out to the people at these companies that I've been working with across our sponsors. So Azra and Thomas at Figma, Valentina, Danielle, Patrick at Sketch, Max and Andrea at Abstract, Amy, Jen, and Darren at Shopify, Jess and Tarek at Amplitude, Richard and Tom at TWG, Ernie at Clio, and Danielle and Izuru at Intersect. So big round of applause for all the amazing folks. The biggest shout out goes to the DesignX team that helped put together and craft every single part of the experience. If I can request all the team members that are here, do we have anyone? I think they're still working away. Okay, a few. If you see them at the after party, give them a hug if they allow you to, handshake, high five, whatever. But please do show your appreciation for all the hard work the team has put in for the last 6 months almost. I don't have everyone's photos, so also a big shout out to Donna and Jessel, who've been helping us a lot. A big shout out to Nora, my wife there. She's in her final trimester now, and I've been coming late almost every night. So thank you so much for putting up with that. And a big thank you to all of you. We are going to not end it here. We are going to continue at the after party. A big shout out to Liam and Brian and folks at Infotech for hosting us for the after party. It is at 888 Yonge Street. It's about a 15-minute walk if you feel like walking, or it's a 5 to 7 minute ride share. Hope to see all of you there. Thank you so much. Thank you.